Hello, my lovelies. Today I'm going to present to you my first ever flipped lesson, and I must admit that it is a bit awkward because I'm used to standing in front of a classroom, looking into your faces, and being able to determine whether or not you are picking up what I'm putting down. So we'll see how this goes. There will be some activities at the end of this lecture. I want you to make sure that you have your lecture journal at your side because there will be some stop and think questions to answer as we move along. Now, before we begin, please refer to some of the discussions that we've had about this time period when our nation was in turmoil. We last left off talking about the Compromise of 1850 and how it was yet again another attempt by Congress to appease both the North and the South on this issue of slavery, and whether or not to expand slavery into new territories, and whether or not to protect slavery in the states in which it already existed. One of the provisions of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, was intended to appease the southern states on this issue of slavery. But as we will see, it probably added to some of the mounting tensions between the North and the South. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain how the Fugitive Slave Act contributed to greater tension between the North and the South. You will also be able to describe the achievements and impacts of two significant abolitionists. The Fugitive Slave Act required Northerners and local governments to use their resources to help capture and return suspected fugitive slaves. Oftentimes, free blacks, people who were never slaves, were accused and convicted of being fugitive slaves. Bounty hunters, or sometimes they were called slave catchers, invaded northern towns in search of so-called fugitive slaves that they could then turn in for a reward. The Fugitive Slave Act strengthened the abolition movement's resolve to fight to end slavery. Northerners, who were once very far removed from the ugliness of slavery, were now confronted with slave catchers in their own backyard. For the first time, people who were sort of out of touch with the realities of slavery were seeing some of the brutality and some of the ugliness surrounding slavery. In addition, there were also many people who were morally opposed to slavery. They thought it was wrong. And now we have a law such as the Fugitive Slave Act that is requiring people to assist in capturing suspected fugitive slaves. Otherwise, they will face harsh punishments and penalties. Take out your lecture journal and give me one or two sentences. Make a prediction. What problems could arise as a result of requiring Northerners to capture and assist in capturing suspected slaves and also punishing anyone who is assisting fugitive slaves? What problems could arise as a result of Northerners being forced to obey this law? Now, there's a very good chance that you've discussed the Underground Railroad somewhere in your educational career, but it's important that we revisit it because the Underground Railroad really was a successful way, or somewhat successful way, for abolitionists to fight back against laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act. The Underground Railroad was a network of abolitionists who worked together to escort runaway slaves to freedom. People who supported the Underground Railroad, who helped runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, were known as conductors. And they often gave food, hiding places, and disguises to help slaves in the South escape to northern states or to Canada. The reason why I'm bringing up the Underground Railroad again is because the Underground Railroad reached its peak during this newest Fugitive Slave Act between 1850 and 1860. So I think that demonstrates how the Fugitive Slave Act increased the movement of fugitive slaves rather than necessarily frightened people away from trying to escape. A Tale of Two Harriets. Now, this first Harriet, you probably recognize. There's a good chance that you have heard the name Harriet Tubman and have seen her picture before. But we're going to discuss her again because she has a pretty significant place in American history. Harriet Tubman was a runaway slave who suffered severe abuse and still managed to escape slavery. And not only did she escape, but she went back to the area of the South to help over 300 slaves cross into freedom. Harriet Tubman as a conductor of the Underground Railroad, took 19 trips after she had escaped slavery to go back and help people. Now, it's important that we talk about this a little bit because what Harriet Tubman did was she ran back into the burning building. Harriet Tubman escaped. She was free. She was no longer a slave. And yet she went back knowing that if she was caught, she could be captured and returned to slavery, or even worse, she could be killed. In addition, because she had taken so many trips, people knew about her. Slaves knew about her, slaveholders knew about her, so there was a very good chance that if she was found, she would be killed on sight. Now, I want you to think for a moment. If you were to have escaped a burning building, after you escaped, there is a good chance that the police and the firemen would have set up a barrier so that you could not run back into the burning building to save belongings or pets or even people because the danger would be too great. In fact, after having come through such a horrible experience of escaping a burning building, you might not have the courage or the desire or even the ability to run back into the burning building to save someone else. Harriet Tubman did just that. To her, the South under slavery was a burning building, and she ran back into it 19 times in order to save people. During this time period, she gathered friendships, got to know people, and so she called upon those people that she knew who were still captive slaves to get information for her, and she actually served, little known fact, served as a spy for the Union Army about what the Confederate Army was doing. Now, I realize that we haven't discussed the war specifically yet, but I think you can gather from this that the Confederate Army was the South during the Civil War and the Union Army was the North during the Civil War. And Harriet Tubman served as a spy for the Union Army by calling on people that she knew in the South to gather information for her that she could then relay. Harriet Tubman also led the Union Army on a gunboat raid into Confederate territory because she knew the route so well. Now, we know that Harriet Tubman's contributions to the Union Army was significant because a number of years later, when she finally passed away, Harriet Tubman was actually honored with a military funeral for her service. If you know of anybody who is in the military, currently serving or has served, then you probably have some idea that the military just doesn't dish out honors for no reason. They saw her as a real asset, and they honored her in her death with this special military funeral. Now, there's a few things I want you to consider about that. First, Harriet Tubman was a former slave. Second, she was a woman. Third, she was black. And fourth, this was over 100 years ago. And yet she was still given this very prestigious honor of a military funeral. I think that speaks to tell us how important Harriet Tubman is to American history. Now you're going to stop and write in your lecture journal again. What other interesting fact do you know about Harriet Tubman? Now I've already said you've probably heard about her before somewhere in your schooling or maybe somewhere else. But also there has been quite a bit of talk about Harriet Tubman in the news. And so maybe you know what I'm hinting at. And if you do, go ahead and write that down. Otherwise, share something else that you might know about her or something that you think you might know about her. If you need to pause to write, go ahead and do so. So our next Harriet is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe, like Harriet Tubman, was an abolitionist, except she was never a slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in a northern state that bordered a southern slave state. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe had had some experience with slavery. She had traveled into slave territory before and had seen some of the brutality and ugliness of slavery firsthand. In addition, she had met people who were former slaves who told her stories about some of the things that they had experienced. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe came from a family who was pretty much opposed to slavery. However, none of them took it as far to be such a great abolitionist as Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she did so by writing a very famous novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin brought to life the sick brutality of slavery, and it discussed the murder of innocent slaves. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe may not have seen with her own eyes what actually happened in some of the stories that she describes, but she was able to depict what happened in her novel. This was a time period where there wasn't cable news and there weren't memes on social media for us to click on and learn a little bit more about something that's going on in the world. People got their news from reading. And while Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel wasn't an actual nonfiction news story, it still painted a picture of some of the things that actually happened in the system of slavery. This novel, along with Northerners' experiences with the Fugitive Slave Act, sparked a newer and more powerful flame in favor of abolition that just would not be put out. Now, President Lincoln referred to Harriet Beecher Stowe as the little lady who made the big war. Now, it's true, Harriet Beecher Stowe and her novel did not directly contribute to the cause of the Civil War, but the words that Harriet Beecher Stowe shared and the story that she told spread, and it started to open people's eyes to something that they had never previously fully understood. For the first time, people who had no real experience with slavery or weren't even really considering it that much were getting an eye-opening revelation about some of the sick, horrible things that happened in this slavery system. So for your lecture journal, I want you to stop and write 3 to 4 sentences about a time when you had an eye-opening revelation. Now, you're all 8th graders, so you've been on this planet for about 14 years or so, and you've had some experiences. You've learned about some things in life. I want you to think about maybe the first time that you learned about poverty, or the first time that you learned about racism, or the first time that you learned about illnesses such as cancer that even claimed the lives of children. And the first time that you've heard about something really tragic and considered it for the first time. I want you to think about and write about what was it that you learned that was eye-opening. And how did you learn about it? Did you learn about it from a friend? Did you learn about it from someone at school? Did you learn about it from a television program? How did you learn about it? And then how did it make you feel when you learned about this thing that you now couldn't really unlearn? That your eyes were now open to something that wasn't real positive in the world. And now you couldn't, forget that you ever learned it. So you're going to include that in your lecture journal. Now, we've completed our lecture. I want you to return or refer to the TED Ed lesson. You're going to think a little bit more deeply about this topic, and you're going to be able to show me what you learned. You're going to talk in a little bit more detail about Harriet Tubman especially, and the Fugitive Slave Act, and how some of those things really impacted this time period leading up to the Civil War. Thanks so much for participating and listening, and I can't wait to see you in class.